The storm clouds assembled over Warren County as evening fell on September 14, 1859, sweeping in from the west carrying that particular darkness that made even the livestock grow uneasy. On his plantation porch, Silas Garrison stood watching the Yazoo River push past its boundaries, doing what it did every autumn when the rains arrived with sudden fury. The temperature had fallen to 54 degrees, enough chill to make a man shiver when his clothes got wet, enough cold to crush the spirit of anyone left exposed for hours. Garrison had performed this ritual since 1847, 12 years of picking one slave each September to fasten to that old hickory tree during the season's worst storm. It maintained order, he believed. It reminded every soul on the property exactly whose hands held the power over life and death. Before this revenge tale continues, remember to subscribe to the channel and tell us which city you're listening from. Appreciate you, and let's move forward. But something felt different about that particular evening. The air carried a strange electricity that had nothing to do with the lightning approaching. When the overseer hauled Isaac Turner from the quarters toward that punishment tree, the tall, quiet man did something nobody had witnessed in 12 years of this brutal custom. He smiled. Not the fearful grimace trying to pass as defiance. Not the wild grin of someone whose mind had snapped under bondage's weight, but a genuine smile that seemed to carry understanding the others couldn't grasp. The chains wrapped around his wrists were those same 5-1 Balos 2mm links, typically used for restraining cattle. Heavy enough to hold a bull, more than adequate to secure a person against a tree trunk. Yet Isaac Turner smiled as the metal bit his flesh, smiled when the first raindrops started falling, smiled while Silas Garrison turned his back and walked toward his warm main house. That storm hitting Warren County, that night ranks among the worst anyone could recall. Rain fell in sheets, so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Lightning split the sky with such violence that even hardened men grew afraid. Thunder shook the plantation house windows hard enough to rattle those expensive glass panes Garrison had imported from New Orleans. The wind screamed through the fields with enough force to flatten tobacco plants and rip branches from trees that had stood for 100 years. Any reasonable person would have assumed the man chained to that hickory would be half dead by morning, his body and spirit broken. A living lesson to every other slave on the property about what happened when resistance even crossed your mind. But when dawn broke across the Mississippi Delta, the scene waiting at that hickory tree defied every expectation. Marks scarred the trunk itself, marks that shouldn't have been possible. Cuts so fine and exact, they could only have come from specialized tools, the kind of blades farriers used when metal needed absolute precision work. The chains lay coiled on the muddy ground, intact and unopened yet completely empty, and Isaac Turner was gone. Not just gone, but vanished so thoroughly it was as if he'd never existed there at all. During the following days, overseers found footprints around the property, but they faced backward. The heel where toes should be, the toes where heels belonged. It was an actual technique used by trained runaways to confuse tracking dogs, making pursuers believe you were heading the opposite direction. Someone on that plantation had been planning this escape for a very long time, waiting for exactly the right moment to transform Silas Garrison's instrument of terror into an opportunity for freedom. What Garrison didn't grasp that night, what none of the white men ruling over Delta plantations could understand, was that they'd been training their own destruction through every cruel act. For 12 years, they'd been teaching their slaves about patterns and vulnerabilities, about exactly when overseers got distracted and which tools could be taken without immediate notice. They'd been showing the limits of their authority, Every time they assumed chains and violence could break the human spirit, and men like Isaac Turner had been observing, learning, and getting ready. This wasn't merely one escape. It marked the beginning of something that would sweep across Mississippi plantations like wildfire. A wave of resistance using the master's own rituals against them. That practice of chaining slaves during storms wasn't unique to the Garrison Plantation. Across the delta on properties stretching from Vicksburg to Clarksdale, from the Yazoo River to the Tallahatchie, masters had created their own versions of weather-based punishment. Some believed the combination of cold, rain, and fear created perfect conditions for crushing a rebellious spirit. Others viewed it as entertainment, a way to display their absolute authority, while nature itself seemed to rage in agreement. Those storms sweeping across Mississippi each autumn arrived predictably, coming with the seasonal flooding that made the delta so fertile and so treacherous. The rivers would rise, the temperature would fall, and rain would fall for hours or sometimes days at a stretch. It provided perfect cover for cruel acts that might otherwise attract unwanted attention from neighboring properties or traveling merchants. The hickory tree on the Garrison Plantation had been chosen specifically for its location and qualities. It stood alone in a field about 200 yards from the main house, far enough to muffle screams, yet close enough for Garrison to watch from his porch if he chose. Hickory wood ranks among the strongest and most resilient of all North American hardwoods, capable of holding weight and withstanding impacts that would split lesser trees. That particular specimen Garrison used had a trunk nearly 4 feet in diameter, its bark rough and deeply furrowed, perfect for scraping skin when someone got pressed against it by wind and rain. Deep grooves worn into the bark at chest height showed where chains had been wrapped year after year, the metal slowly eating into the living wood. But that hickory tree held secret Silas Garrison never suspected. Its root system spread in a complex network beneath the field, creating channels and hollows where water collected during heavy rains. These natural underground passages connected to drainage ditches crisscrossing the plantation, part of an elaborate system designed to prevent the fields from becoming completely waterlogged during flood season. Someone who knew about these channels could move beneath the surface, could appear and disappear in ways that seemed impossible to anyone watching from above ground. And someone who had lived on that plantation for years would have had plenty of time to explore every hidden corner, every secret passage, every weakness in the system that held them captive. Isaac Turner had arrived at the Garrison Plantation in 1852, purchased at a Vicksburg auction for $900, a significant sum reflecting his size, strength, and apparent health. The bill of sale described him as approximately 28 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall, with no visible scars or injuries that might reduce his value. What the document didn't mention, what couldn't be written down or quantified in dollars and cents, was that Isaac Turner had spent his childhood on a South Carolina plantation where elderly slaves passed down knowledge, stretching back across the Atlantic, techniques for survival and resistance refined over generations. He understood how to read weather patterns through bird and insect behavior. He knew which plants could provide medicine and which could cause illness without leaving obvious traces. He could move through woods and swamps in near silence, a skill learned from men who had successfully run away and returned to share their knowledge with those still trapped in bondage. For 7 years, Isaac Turner did exactly what was expected. He worked the fields from dawn until dusk, spoke only when spoken to, showed no signs of the intelligence and planning occupying his thoughts during every waking moment. He watched the overseers, learning their routines and habits. He noted which ones drank heavily at night and which ones fell asleep during their watch shifts. He memorized the layout of every building on the plantation, the location of every tool and weapon, the schedule of every activity from morning prayers to evening lockdown. And he befriended the blacksmith, a free black man named Clement, who came to the plantation twice monthly to shoe horses and repair equipment. Clement taught him about metal, about how heat could weaken even the strongest chains, about which tools could cut through iron, if you had enough time and the right angle of approach. The smile Isaac Turner wore on that September evening in 1859 wasn't bravado or madness. It was the expression of a man who knew exactly what was about to happen, who had spent 7 years preparing for this single night. Hidden beneath his shirt rested a tool he'd made himself, ground down from a stolen farrier's file over months, shaped into a thin blade capable of working into the weakest point of standard cattle chains. In his memory lay a map of every drainage channel within 2 miles of the plantation, routes he'd explored during brief moments of unsupervised work, paths that would take him to the river and beyond. And in his heart burned a determination, forged by 7 years of waiting, of pretending to be broken while his mind remained free, of watching other men and women suffer under Silas Garrison's cruelty, while he prepared for the moment when he could strike back. The storm provided perfect cover. Rain fell so heavy that visibility dropped to almost nothing. The wind carried away sounds that might otherwise have been heard. The lightning created moments of bright illumination, followed by absolute darkness, making it nearly impossible for anyone to track movement or distinguish shapes in the chaos. Isaac waited until the storm reached its peak intensity, until he could hear nothing but thunder and feel nothing but rain hammering down like fists. Then he went to work on those chains. The weakness he'd created months earlier, heating and cooling a single link repeatedly in the blacksmith's forge, while Clement looked the other way, had transformed solid iron into something brittle enough to break with the right pressure. It took him less than 5 minutes to work his makeshift tool into the damaged link and lever it apart. The rest was just silence and speed. Those backward footprints were a calculated message. Isaac knew that tracking dogs would be released as soon as his absence was discovered. He also knew the handlers would follow the clearest trail, assuming a fleeing slave would run in panic without thought for covering tracks. By creating false trails leading the wrong direction, he bought himself precious hours while the searchers went north, when he was actually heading south, while they focused on open fields, when he was moving through the swamps, while they assumed he was alone, when he might have had help waiting in the darkness. Every minute they wasted following false trails was another mile between him and recapture. Another step closer to something resembling freedom. But Isaac Turner's escape was merely the beginning. His smile before punishment wasn't just personal satisfaction. It was recognition of a larger pattern, an understanding that the time was right for change, that the careful balance of terror maintaining the plantation system was beginning to crack. Across the Mississippi Delta, on dozens of properties where masters believed they had perfected the art of control, slaves were watching and learning and preparing. The rituals meant to break their spirits were instead teaching about timing and opportunity. The isolation designed to prevent communication was actually creating networks of resistance operating beneath the surface of daily plantation life. And the storm's masters, used as instruments of cruelty, were becoming symbols of something else entirely. Moments when the natural world seemed to rage against the unnatural institution of slavery itself. The years leading up to Isaac Turner's escape had been marked by increasing tension. throughout the Mississippi Delta. The election of 1856 had brought national attention to the question of slavery's expansion into new territories, and even in the isolated world of the plantations, slaves heard fragments of news about debates in Congress, about violence in Kansas, about the possibility that the entire system might someday end. These rumors traveled through invisible networks, passed from traveling preachers to field workers, from house servants who overheard dinner conversations to skilled craftsmen who moved between plantations. The information was often incomplete and sometimes inaccurate, but it created a sense that change was possible, that the institution seeming so permanent might actually have an expiration date. On the Dorson plantation in 1855, 4 years before Isaac Turner's escape, something similar had happened during a September storm. The overseer had chained a man named Samuel to a white oak tree standing at the edge of the cotton fields, a massive specimen used for punishments for decades. White oak was chosen specifically for its hardness and resistance to weathering, wood that would last for generations even under the harshest conditions. The tree carried a reputation on the plantation, a history written in pain and fear that made even the boldest slaves avoid walking too close to its shadow. When the storm passed, the overseers expected to find Samuel broken and barely alive, a warning to anyone else thinking about resistance. Instead, they found the tree marked with deep cuts that shouldn't have been possible, grooves carved into the trunk with a precision suggesting professional tools and unhurried work. Samuel himself was back in the quarters, completely dry despite every inch of the plantation being waterlogged from hours of torrential rain. The only explanation making sense was that he'd used the underground drainage system, channels dug years earlier, to manage seasonal flooding, which also created a hidden network of passages beneath the plantation grounds. These channels were supposed to be known only to the overseers and white men managing the property's infrastructure. The fact that a slave had mapped them suggested a level of observation and intelligence most masters refused to acknowledge their captives possessed. 3 days after the storm, the seed barn caught fire. The structure was worth more than $1,000, filled with carefully selected seeds for the next planting season, along with tools and equipment expensive to replace. The fire started in the middle of the night, spreading so quickly that nothing could be saved. When the ashes cooled, the burning pattern showed the fire had started in a perfect circle, the kind of distribution you get when someone pours accelerant in a deliberate pattern before lighting it. Pine oil was missing from the maintenance shed, a substance that burned hot and fast and was used for treating wood and metal to prevent rust. The connection was obvious to everyone on the plantation, though no one spoke it aloud. This wasn't an accident. It was a message written in flame and ash, a declaration that the people held in bondage were neither helpless nor stupid, that they could hurt their oppressors in ways felt for months to come. The Dorson plantation never recovered from that fire. The lost seeds meant a delayed planting season, which meant a reduced crop, which meant less money to purchase supplies and maintain the property. Workers had to be hired from neighboring plantations to help with the harvest, an additional expense eating into already diminished profits, and the fear settling over the white residents of the property changed the atmosphere in ways hard to quantify but impossible to ignore. The overseers became more vigilant, which meant they were also more tired and more prone to mistakes. The master began sleeping with loaded pistols by his bed, starting awake at every sound in the night. And the slaves, even those with nothing to do with the fire, walked with a different posture, a subtle straightening of the spine suggesting they understood the balance of power wasn't as absolute as it once seemed. In Madison County in 1858, a master named Thaddeus Brennan used storms as theater, staging his punishments during the worst weather specifically, because he believed lightning and thunder increased the psychological impact. Madison County was known for electrical storms, among the most violent in the state, with lightning strikes carrying more than 30,000 amperes. Enough power to split trees and kill livestock instantly. Brennan would force slaves to watch as he chained someone to a metal stake during these storms, laughing as the terrified witnesses prayed the prisoner wouldn't be struck dead by lightning. He considered it the ultimate demonstration of his God, like power over life and death, a reminder that he could expose them to mortal danger with complete impunity. But after one particularly violent storm, in August of 1858, the overseers found 2 sets of footprints in the mud around the punishment site. One set clearly came from the slave chained there. The other came from a larger person wearing work boots, with a distinctive, twisted sole matching the footwear of Henry Cole, the head overseer and Brennan's most trusted employee. The tracks suggested a struggle, 2 people moving around each other in the darkness, then leading off toward the property's eastern boundary, where a fence had been broken. A search party went out at dawn, but all they found was Henry Cole's hat caught on a fence post, the expensive felt already soaked and ruined by rain. Henry Cole himself was never seen again. The official story in Virginia was that Cole had gone to check on the prisoner during the storm and been struck by lightning or swept away by flooding. But the slaves knew better. They whispered about it in the quarters at night, voices so low they could barely be heard, even by people standing right next to them. They talked about how Henry Cole had been the cruelest overseer on the property, a man who took pleasure in inflicting pain, who had separated countless families and broken up couples for his own amusement. They spoke about justice delivered in darkness, about scores settled when the natural chaos of storms provided cover for acts impossible in daylight. And they mentioned a name that had started circulating among the plantations, a figure who was part reality and part legend, someone moving between properties, helping slaves take revenge on their worst tormentors. Whether this figure actually existed or was simply a story people told themselves to maintain hope is impossible to say with certainty. What matters is that belief in such a person changed behavior. Overseers became more cautious, more aware that their cruelty might be answered with violence. Masters started questioning whether their traditional methods of control were as effective as they'd always assumed, and slaves found courage in the idea that resistance was possible, that they weren't completely helpless against the system holding them captive. Even a story, if enough people believe it, can become a kind of truth that changes the world around it. The psychological warfare accompanying these acts of resistance was as important as the physical damage. Every unexplained disappearance, every mysterious fire, every impossible escape created doubt in the minds of plantation owners. They began questioning their own perceptions, wondering whether their slaves were really as docile as they appeared during daylight hours. Sleep became difficult for many masters, their nights interrupted by every sound, every shadow that might indicate danger. Some began drinking more heavily to calm their nerves. Others grew increasingly paranoid, seeing threats and conspiracies everywhere, treating their most loyal servants with suspicion, damaging the relationships they relied on to maintain control. On the Morrison Plantation in 1860, the chains themselves betrayed their purpose. A slave woman named Ruth was supposed to be secured to the punishment tree during a storm, restrained with what was labeled an iron shackle number 12, a piece of equipment normally imported from New Orleans and used for restraining mules and other large livestock. These shackles were considered absolutely reliable, forged from high-quality iron and tested to hold against pulling power of animals outweighing any human by hundreds of pounds. But when the overseer tried to lock the shackle around Ruth's wrists, the mechanism simply wouldn't close. The pin holding the lock in place had been weakened, heated and cooled repeatedly until the metal became brittle, a technique requiring both knowledge of metalwork and access to a forge. The overseer, suspecting sabotage, went to get another set of chains. While he was gone, Ruth collapsed to the ground, seemingly overcome by fear or exhaustion. But her apparent weakness was a performance, a calculated act allowing her to observe everything happening around her, while the white men assumed she was too broken to threaten anyone. She watched where they kept keys, noted which of them was most distracted, memorized the exact route they took when leaving her alone, and when opportunity came, she was ready to move with speed and purpose, shocking everyone who had assumed physical collapse meant mental surrender. The next morning, Silas Garrison himself woke up chained to his own punishment tree, secured with his own locks. The key mysteriously vanished. He spent 4 hours in the rain before anyone found him. 4 hours experiencing what he'd inflicted on others for more than a decade. The physical discomfort was bad enough, but the psychological impact was devastating. Every slave on the plantation knew what had happened. They'd seen their master reduced to a helpless prisoner, had watched him experience the same fear and humiliation he'd used as tools of control. Even after he was freed, even after the most violent reprisals he could devise, the knowledge remained. The illusion of absolute power had been shattered, revealed as something more fragile than anyone had imagined. Along the Tallahatchie River in 1853, the silence itself became a form of resistance. During punishment rituals, the screams of victims were part of the intended effect. Sounds meant to terrify everyone within earshot and reinforce consequences of disobedience. But during one storm, when an overseer went to check on a man chained to the punishment tree, he found absolute silence. Not the silence of death, but something stranger and more unsettling. The rain had been heavy enough to reduce sound transmission, but not enough to completely muffle cries of pain from someone experiencing what should have been hours of agony. When they examined the tree, they found the rope cut with surgical precision, a clean 3-centimeter slice through tough hemp that could only have been made with an extremely sharp blade, the kind of tool a skilled blacksmith would use for detail work. Before dawn, doors throughout the plantation house were found broken, smashed with what appeared to be a mallet hammer, a heavy tool missing from the workshop months earlier. The breaks were clean and powerful, showing that whoever wielded the hammer knew exactly how to strike for maximum damage with minimum effort. Nothing was stolen from the house. No one was injured. But the message was crystal clear. The boundaries meant to protect white residents from the enslaved population they controlled were permeable. Locks and walls weren't absolute barriers. If slaves could break into the house, they could do anything they wanted to the people sleeping inside. The psychological impact of that realization spread through the white community like a disease, creating paranoia and fear, undermining the confidence required to maintain the plantation system. In Claiborne County in 1857, a massive storm with winds exceeding 60 miles per hour tore across the landscape, ripping roofs off tobacco, curing barns, and uprooting trees standing for a century. The punishment tree on the Hartwell plantation was struck by lightning, a bolt powerful enough to leave a vertical crack running from crown to roots, the kind of damage arborists recognize as characteristic of high-voltage electrical discharge. But the burned section was on the opposite side of the tree, from where the slave should have been chained, meaning he was already gone when the lightning hit. The chains hung empty, and the man himself had vanished into the storm. That same night, the main barn caught fire in 2 separate locations simultaneously, a pattern that can only be created deliberately by someone understanding how fire spreads and wanting to ensure complete destruction. 2-point ignition meant the arsonist had moved quickly and confidently, setting one fire and then circling to the opposite end of the structure to set another before the first was noticed. It required planning, courage, and willingness to risk death if caught, and it worked perfectly. The barn burned to its foundation despite the rain, taking with it the entire season's tobacco crop along with equipment worth thousands of dollars. The Hartwell family never rebuilt. They sold what remained of the property at a loss and moved to Natchez, broken not just financially, but spiritually by understanding they couldn't protect themselves against enemies with nothing left to lose. In 1852, on a plantation near the Big Black River, a forbidden song rose above the sound of rain and wind. It was a gullah chant inherited from the rice people of West Africa, brought across the Atlantic in memories of kidnapped men and women refusing to let their culture die, even in captivity. The masters had forbidden such songs because they recognized them as symbols of spiritual resistance, expressions of identity and community existing outside the plantation's power structure. The call and response pattern wasn't just music. It was code, a way of communicating complex information disguised as religious expression, a tradition stretching back centuries and continuing despite every attempt to suppress it. At 3:12 in the morning, during the darkest part of night, when even the most vigilant overseer might be nodding off, the same chant emerged from the porch of the master's house, sung by a voice that shouldn't have been able to get anywhere near that location without being seen or heard. The song lasted for exactly 1 minute, then vanished back into the storm. 2 overseers quit the next morning, refusing to explain their decision, packing their belongings and leaving before noon despite having car tracks running through harvest season. The rumors following them suggested they'd seen something on the porch that night, a figure or figures who had somehow infiltrated the heart of the plantation's power structure, who could have killed everyone in the house if they'd chosen to, but who instead delivered a warning wrapped in ancient melody. The cultural traditions surviving the Middle Passage and brutality of plantation slavery were themselves forms of resistance. Every story told in the quarters, every song sung in the fields, every recipe passed from grandmother to grandchild was an assertion that enslaved people had histories and identities existing independently of their master's control. The Gullah language developing along the coast mixed English with African grammatical structures and vocabulary, creating a means of communication white overseers couldn't fully understand. Spiritual practices blended Christianity with older traditions, producing a faith emphasizing liberation and justice rather than obedience and submission. Even the way food was prepared became an act of cultural preservation, maintaining connections to African cuisines and agricultural knowledge predating enslavement. Between the swamps of the Yazoo Delta in 1863, during the Civil War chaos, when the plantation system was already beginning to collapse, a storm passed and left only chains lying empty in the mud. The prisoner was gone. But more significantly, tools were discovered in the stable stolen from the Mitchell and Son smithy in 1841, 22 years earlier. These weren't just any tools. They were specialized implements for precision metalwork, items a professional smith would immediately recognize and an amateur would have no use for. The fact they'd been hidden for more than 2 decades suggested planning on a scale most white observers couldn't comprehend. preparation spanning generations rather than months or years. Within a week, the harvest storage building was destroyed from the inside, damaged so thoroughly the structure had to be torn down and rebuilt. But there were no signs of forced entry, meaning either someone had a key or the building had been left unlocked, probably by a sympathizer among the white employees. The sabotage was sophisticated, targeting support beams and structural elements in ways causing maximum damage while creating the appearance the building had simply failed due to age and poor maintenance. Insurance investigators couldn't prove arson, meaning owners couldn't collect payment for their losses. They were forced to absorb the full cost of rebuilding at a time when money and resources were already stretched thin by the war. In Jefferson County in 1864, as Union forces pushed deeper into Mississippi and the Confederacy's grip on the Delta began to weaken, the punishment tree itself finally fell. The white oak, standing for more than 40 years, witnessing countless acts of cruelty and serving as monument to the plantation's power, came down during a storm. Initial reports suggested wind was responsible, but closer examination revealed the tree had been weakened from inside. Cut carefully over weeks or months with tools designed to work wood, without leaving obvious external marks. It was forestry sabotage at its most calculated, a patient act of resistance that must have taken extraordinary courage given consequences if discovered. When the tree fell, it revealed something else: drag marks in the mud, deep grooves, suggesting something heavy had been pulled approximately 20 meters toward the swamp, bordering the eastern edge of property. The marks were consistent with a body being moved, though no body was ever found. The master of the plantation, a man named Josiah Mercer, who had ruled over more than 300 enslaved people with legendary cruelty, disappeared that same night. Search parties combed the swamps for weeks, but the landscape of a Mississippi Delta swamp is uniquely suited to concealing evidence. The water is dark and deep, full of vegetation trapping and hiding objects indefinitely. Alligators and other scavengers eliminate organic material with remarkable efficiency. And the constantly shifting channels and pools mean even if you search the same location twice, the terrain might have changed enough to reveal or conceal what was previously visible or hidden. Josiah Mercer was never found and the plantation never recovered. Without his driving cruelty to enforce labor, crop yields dropped. Without his reputation to intimidate neighboring properties, other slaves began running away or resisting. Within 2 years, the property was abandoned, fields returning to wilderness, buildings collapsing as the Delta slowly reclaimed land taken through violence and exploitation. Nature proved a more implacable force than even the most brutal system of human control, patient and inevitable, overwhelming everything eventually, no matter how permanent it seemed. The Civil War accelerated the plantation system's collapse, but groundwork had been laid years earlier by accumulated acts of resistance, both large and small. Every escape weakened the system by removing labor and demonstrating freedom was possible. Every act of sabotage cost money and resources plantations couldn't afford to lose. Every moment of defiance chipped away at psychological foundations, making slavery seem natural and inevitable to people benefiting from it. By the time Union troops arrived in Mississippi, they found plantations already in various states of disintegration, their authority undermined from within by people who had never accepted their enslavement as legitimate or permanent. The smile Isaac Turner wore on that September evening in 1859 was the smile of a man understanding change was coming, that the system enslaving him was more fragile than it appeared. That resistance was not only possible, but inevitable. It was the smile of someone who had watched and learned and prepared, who knew the master's own rituals and habits created vulnerabilities that would eventually destroy them. And it was the smile of a man, representing thousands of others across the South, refusing to accept their bondage as permanent, working in ways large and small to undermine the institution claiming ownership of their bodies, while their minds remained free. The storms sweeping across Mississippi every autumn continued long after the Civil War, ended slavery as a legal institution. The hickory trees and white oaks serving as punishment posts eventually rotted and fell, replaced by new growth bearing no scars of the past. The plantations seeming so permanent and powerful dissolved into history, their grand houses becoming ruins, their carefully cultivated fields returning to forest and swamp. But the stories survived. They passed from generation to generation, carried forward by people understanding that remembering was itself an act of resistance, that bearing witness to what had been done prevented the past from being sanitized or forgotten. The techniques of resistance slaves developed during those years became templates for civil rights activism a century later. The networks of communication, disguised as religious services, evolved into organizing infrastructure of churches during the freedom movement. The careful observation and exploitation of authority figures' weaknesses became the strategic analysis, allowing outnumbered protesters to outmaneuver much larger opposition forces. And the refusal to accept humiliation and cruelty as inevitable transformed into moral certainty demanding justice and equality. When modern historians examine the plantation system, they often focus on its brutality and efficiency, on ways it extracted maximum profit from human suffering, on legal and social structures maintaining it across generations. But they sometimes miss the other story, the one told in empty chains and burned barns, in songs sung when forbidden, in the smile of a man facing punishment who knew he would be free before morning. This is the story of resistance that never stopped, of intelligence and courage surviving despite every attempt to crush it, of human dignity that could not be chained to a tree, no matter how heavy the chains or how violent the storm. The Mississippi Delta today is a different place, changed by war and time and the slow, grinding work of justice. The rivers still flood in autumn, and storms still sweep across the flat landscape with wind and lightning and rain falling hard enough to hurt. But there are no punishment trees standing in the fields anymore. No chains waiting to bind human beings to rough bark during the coldest hours before dawn. The land remembers, though. The earth itself holds memory of what happened there. Absorption of suffering and resistance both, a complex history that cannot be simplified into stories of either pure victimhood or impossible heroism, because truth is more complicated than either narrative allows. The people surviving slavery were not saints, and they were not helpless victims. They were human beings facing impossible circumstances, making choices with no good options, finding ways to maintain their humanity in a system designed to reduce them to property. Some collaborated with oppressors because survival required it. Some resisted openly and paid with their lives. Most did something in between, navigating a landscape where every decision involved risk, where kindness could be as dangerous as cruelty, where the line between survival and surrender was measured in moments and inches. Isaac Turner's escape was both exceptional and ordinary. Exceptional because it required planning, skill, courage, and luck in precisely the right combinations at exactly the right time. Ordinary because it was one of thousands of similar acts happening across the South every year. Small victories against a system seeming invincible, but containing seeds of its own destruction. He represented something larger than himself, a pattern of resistance operating beneath the surface of plantation life, invisible to most white observers, but always present, always working toward the moment when chains could be broken for good. The historical record doesn't tell us what happened to Isaac Turner after that night in September 1859. He vanished into the storm and never appeared in any document surviving to the present day. He might have made it to freedom in the North, might have joined the Union Army when war finally came, might have lived to see slavery abolished and return to Mississippi as a free man. Or he might have been caught and killed within days, his body left in a field as warning to anyone else thinking about escape. We don't know. And in some ways it doesn't matter. What matters is the smile, the moment of defiant knowledge preceding his liberation, the understanding that even in darkest circumstances, human beings can find ways to resist, to fight back, to refuse the role oppression tries to force them into. The storms still come to Mississippi every autumn, and rivers still rise beyond their banks, and temperature still drops on certain September evenings, in ways making even warm-blooded creatures seek shelter. But the landscape has changed in ways going deeper than the merely physical. Where there were once plantations, worked by enslaved people, there are now small farms and growing towns. Where there were once punishment trees, there are now memorials to those suffering and dying under slavery. Where there were once chains and violence, there is now sometimes and imperfectly justice. The history of American slavery is a history of unimaginable cruelty, but it is also a history of resistance and survival. For every act of violence committed by enslavers, there was an act of resistance by the enslaved. For every attempt to break the human spirit, there was a refusal to be broken. For every chain meant to hold a person captive, there was someone working to find weakness in the metal, flaw in the system, moment when freedom became possible. This is not a story with a simple moral or easy conclusion. It is instead a reminder that human beings contain multitudes, that we are capable of both terrible cruelty and extraordinary courage, often simultaneously, often in ways contradicting each other and refusing neat categorization. The smile Isaac Turner wore before punishment was a smile echoing across time, forward into a future he would never see, backward to connect with resistance of ancestors he had never met. It was the smile of someone refusing to accept the world as presented to him, working with patience and intelligence to change circumstances seeming unchangeable, understanding that even smallest act of defiance mattered because it proved the spirit could not be chained, even when the body was. And in that moment, on that September evening in 1859, with storm clouds gathering and chains waiting and a cruel master watching from his porch, Isaac Turner demonstrated a truth the plantation system could never acknowledge. That the enslaved were not property, but people, not victims, but survivors, not helpless, but full of a power that would eventually bring the entire system crashing down. The lesson of the punishment tree, if there is a lesson to be extracted from such a dark piece of history, is that oppression always contains seeds of its own destruction. Every act of cruelty teaches the oppressed something about weakness of the oppressor. Every ritual of humiliation creates opportunities for resistance. Every demonstration of power reveals its limits. The masters believed they were building a system lasting forever, that combination of violence and economic exploitation and legal protection would allow them to maintain control across generations. But they were wrong. They were training their own downfall with every storm, teaching resistance with every chain, undermining their own authority with every ritual designed to reinforce it. And somewhere in darkness of that September night in 1859, Isaac Turner disappeared into freedom, carrying with him knowledge that had set him free and memory of those remaining behind. His smile in the face of punishment was a promise. a declaration that the story wasn't over. That justice was coming even if it came slowly, that the human spirit could not be permanently broken no matter how heavy the chains or how violent the storm. It was a smile saying, "We are still here. We are still fighting. And eventually we will win." And history, with all its complications and tragedies and imperfect victories, proved him right.